During the late 2000s, in a meth-induced haze of Sino-futurism, English philosopher Nick Land had a breakdown and moved to China. There, he proceeded to write a series of long love letters to the Chinese government, as well as several impenetrable essays heaped with praise and adoration for the Communist Party, its leaders, and what he sees as China's ingenious synthesis of capitalistic and communistic economics. Lauding the CCP for its accelerationist attitude towards the future and its exponential leaps in technology over the past 2 centuries, Land coined the term NeoChina, not to be confused with, but possibly linked to, the Chinese state-backed crypto designed to rival Ethereum, Neo. Perhaps, when presented with the sweeping projects of the Chinese state, Land's previous libertarian contempt for the capabilities of governments just faded away, or perhaps China was paying. It's hard to tell. From the outside looking in, China can be a confusing, even intimidating place. Vast and immensely populous, fiercely imposing on the world stage, and unapologetically and vehemently nationalistic, the People's Republic appears to be an ideological, cultural, and genetic monolith when compared to the West. In many respects, this is indeed true. While there are officially 56 ethnic groups represented inside China itself, more than 90% of the Chinese population is comprised of just one ethnic group, the Han Chinese. For a variety of socio-religious reasons, however, not all ethnically Han people actually identify as Han, and in a few cases, some people who aren't Han choose to identify as such culturally, making the situation significantly more complex. When reconsidered broadly, it is still obvious that China is one of the most linguistically, religiously, and geographically diverse regions on the planet. Examining the Han people from the region formerly known as Canton, for example, reveals that their spoken language of Cantonese is further removed from Mandarin Chinese than French is from English or Dutch. Their ways of life and cultural preferences are far more diverse than the differences between, say, Italians and Germans. Whereas some of the country's ethnic groups are distinguishable from the Han by phenotypical appearance due to relatively low intermarriage rates, others have mixed with the Han and resemble them almost entirely. To add to the confusion, children can receive ethnic minority status at birth in China if one of their parents belongs to an ethnic minority, even if their ancestry is predominantly Han Chinese. As late as 2019, the CCP suggested that a growing number of ethnic minorities are adapting to Han cultural life and becoming fluent at a native level in Mandarin. But this is the problem. Depending on who you ask, China is either a brutal technocratic communist dictatorship hell-bent on world domination, or the last line of defense against American global hegemonic power, or the tyranny of the New World Order. This issue is pressing, given the West's proclivity to propagandize China's activities both internationally and domestically, and given China's propensity towards propagandizing its own citizens as well as the Western media, it can be extremely difficult to tell fact from fiction in regards to Chinese state policy. How willing, for example, are Chinese citizens to undergo the more restrictive aspects of Chinese society like censorship, 24/7 facial recognition surveillance, and social credit systems? Are these really that different to the Western surveillance state with all its censorship and its economic credit scores? While the internet continues to squabble over whether or not China is in fact capitalist, communist, Maoist, fascist, Marxist, Leninist, or whatever the fuck, the Chinese economy continues to grow. With a GDP second only to the declining United States, one thing is considered certain amongst the American cultural commentariat. The future is undoubtedly Chinese. Like most anthropological phenomenon, the rise of Neo-China is not easily explained by mere philosophy and politics. In the field of ecology, however, we may have found an answer, in the form of a theory known as RK selection. RK selection is often used to explain the process whereby an organism or culture makes a trade-off between quantity and quality of offspring, and how populations, often of the same species, adopt differing mating and life history strategies to sustain themselves over multiple generations. Organisms that are subject to R selection, often referred to as R-type strategists or R-selected species, are species or subspecies that have large numbers of offspring, which tend to mature extremely quickly. Think bacteria. R species mate a lot and do not typically pair bond or form familial packs, which are more likely to develop in more complex K-type species. K-types usually appear higher up the food chain, have less offspring, and put more energy into developing their offspring over time. A good example of an R-type species is a rabbit, which, well, mates like a rabbit. And a good example of a K-type species would be historically the human being, given that its offspring are so retarded at birth that they don't finish gestating until outside of the womb. Popularized in the 1970s, many ecologists today claim that by the early 1990s, RK theory had largely lost importance when it was criticized by several empirical studies. However, far from debunked altogether, RK is still a useful heuristic for modern ecologists and biological anthropologists. In the case of NeoChina, it goes a long way to explaining the meteoric rise in modern times. Could China, though, be the most K-type society on Earth? J. Philippe Rushton began his academic career in 1977, and by 1989 he had drawn the attention and criticism of the world media for his controversial paper, Race, Evolution, and Behavior. His extensive research charted and categorized what he evidently saw as distinct genetic and heritable differences between racial groups. Many of his observations were as specified as exploring the size of sex organs and secondary sexual characteristics, which many journalists and reporters seem to have taken issue with.
Your book. Now,
Oh, excuse me.
Rushton argued that Asians had the highest impulse control and sexual restraint when compared to blacks and whites, and this was reflected, so Rushton claimed, in the physiological differences, lifespans, gestation rates, and general intelligence rates of black, white, and Asian people, respectively. Then Premier of his university, David Peterson, demanded Rushton be fired, and he was disciplined, sparking further controversy. Seen by many as a hero of academia and a crusader for truth, but by others as a cynical, jaded racist with an axe to grind, Rushton's work has now been largely obscured by history. Whilst not always obvious or indeed even true at an individual level, when extrapolated out across a whole society, the ideas present in Rushton's work seem extremely fitting to the idea of a rising Neo-China. A modern society that is high output, high intelligence, with low outgroup approval and low rates of social trust. With family planning, intensive social obligations, and a focus on the education and advancement of children, it's hard to see China as anything but K-selected in nature. Unfortunately, one can't discuss Rushton's work today in serious academic circles without receiving the same labels and ostracism that he did, despite the fact that his work has largely not been discredited in any serious or meaningful way. Better described as an Asian supremacist than a white supremacist in terms of his work, if Rushton's intent was to make Caucasian people look mediocre in virtually every respect, then I'd say he did a pretty good job. Despite that, the Academy of Sciences continues to attempt to bury his work in the same way as other notable biologists and geneticists who have acknowledged any difference in race that could explain broader differences in culture. In 1990, an exasperated but defiant Rushton told the London Free Press, "I don't know how long the scientific truth can be kept down." Ironically, the Chinese state has few qualms about social justice in the same way as Western media-led governments. Perhaps we won't fully be able to explore why China has become so powerful until China takes over the world.